yeah, a huge part of my journey was just understanding that that was even possible. So which is to celebrate, like, okay, naming that was good, but then to continue through with the journey, which was the scary part. To know thyself is terrifying. It can be, and then to go where you need to go is it's hard, but it's so worth it.
Yeah. To know thyself is really the ultimate journey of life.
Welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast, where we talk about everything from spirituality, self-development, relationships, mindfulness, wellness, and everything that will help you embrace all that you are so you can expand into the best version of yourself.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast. My next guest is a bodyworker who is dedicated to helping people feel comfortable and at home in their bodies. Formerly a research scientist with a background in physiology and neuroscience, he brings extensive practical knowledge and experience, along with infinite curiosity and reverence for the complexity of the body, to his practice. He is passionately dedicated to honoring both the suffering and wisdom held in the body, mind, and spirit of each individual. His practice is driven by an unwavering confidence in the intrinsic healing capacity within every person. I'm excited to dive deeper into the topic of somatics with my next guest, and just so happens to be my cousin as well, Collin Sedlacek. Collin, welcome to the Embrace and Expand podcast.
Yay, thank you so much for having me. Truly an honor to be here, and I love that you dropped our relationship. I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing to note because, you know, of all of the guests that have been on the podcast, I've known you technically longer than any of them because we grew up together.
For sure.
But I've been reflecting over the last couple of weeks of how, you know, as much time as we have spent together over the years at family functions and things like that, it's only really, I feel like, been the last couple of events, specifically Papa's 95th birthday, where we went to that ball game, where you and I really got a chance to talk on a more deeper, singular level and realize like how much we view the world from a very similar lens, even though like how we ventured out into the professional world looked very different. But funny thing is, we've somehow come to somatics as what's brought us back together and professionally moving us forward in our career. So for myself and the listeners, would you mind just taking a few moments to kind of tell us, like, how did you decide to go from your science background to moving kind of full 180 into what you're doing now as a bodyworker?
Yeah, absolutely. It's truly my story. My journey into bodywork is truly a story of my own healing. Is really how it happened. I guess I'll say I love science so much, but I ended up studying it in a way to kind of like, I had grandiose ideas of like, I want to flip the system on its head from the inside. Like I want to go into the research establishment, the medical establishment, because I saw so many shortcomings, which I mentioned because it really lent itself to this transition. Like you said, it was such a flip, like maybe more than 180 degrees to get into this. But I was so primed for it always, in the way that, like I said, getting into research, becoming a scientist, at one point was on the pre-med track, like got into medical school. But at that point I was at the doorstep and was like, wait, this isn't where I want to go at all. Of course, that speaks to how I'm really passionate about helping people and showing up for people and working through healing. But that's all to say that what I was observing and what I originally went into science for was because I saw it failing us, like as a system in a way. Yeah. It's also done so many great things. I got a name that, you know, like if you cut your leg off, it's nice that we have some of the technologies we do so you don't die. But at the same time, it's like there's more technology, there's more medicine, there's more intervention than there ever has been in history. And there's also more disease and suffering, chronic disease especially, and just, you know, general dissatisfaction in ourselves, in our bodies, in our spirits, in our hearts. So I started teaching more at the university I was researching at, and I started having interactions with students, and they were struggling with life things. And I started getting involved in those processes with them and trying to ground them towards, the best versions of themselves. And I started to remember, like, whoa, this is what I'm all about. And I started working on myself in those ways, because, when you start to show up for people, you have to show up for yourself, like the capacity to help heal and to be in that healer role truly rests on a foundation of your own state. Like, how are you? So I started doing a lot of somatic trauma work, going through different organizations and different books. And I was sitting on the beach one summer reading a book, and somebody over my shoulder literally mentioned a massage school that was a couple blocks from where I live. And I looked it up, and 2 weeks later I enrolled. And I was like, I don't know. I still had the hesitation, the reservation, and this rational, like, holding me back mindset. But the more I got into the study of that work, and the more people I met, and the more I did it, the more I truly embraced it, and continued to heal and grow myself. And I didn't actually intend to leave my job as a researcher and instructor at first. But then one day it was like, you know what, I got to choose. I'm either all in, or it's not going to work. I'm not going to be able to really show up for people to help. And so I did it. I quit my job. I went all in. And it's been the best decision I've ever made.
And how long ago was that when you made that decision to make the full switch?
It's only been 2 years now. And it's been an incredible 2 years. I've just seen amazing things. I've witnessed amazing things, and I've grown so much my whole life, in little leaps and bounds, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But in these 2 years of doing this work, I feel like I've hit a whole new plane of understanding of myself, of people, of the healing arts, life in general. And it's been so rewarding, so rewarding. Teaching was great. Research was great. Publishing fancy pants articles was great. It was rewarding, but nothing comes close to just spending an hour or more with somebody and how grateful they are just for, maybe I did something, maybe I didn't. I often tell people when they're like, wow, that was amazing, you're so good. I say, well, that was you. Actually, I was just there. I held space. You felt safe. I listened. Maybe I used this metaphor of shining a light, right? I shone a little spotlight on spots, and then your system, which is capable of doing all the healing and self-organizing it needs, did the work. So it was you. So yeah.
I love that you touch on that the healing is coming from within the client, not from outside of the client. Because anybody that's been listening to this podcast for any amount of time has heard me and many other guests say the same thing, where none of us who truly are passionate about the healing arts will ever call themselves a healer. Mm-hmm. None of us will ever refer to ourselves as a shaman or, any other type of person who's going to have this certain facade of how they're going to show up. Mm-hmm. Those of us that are truly dedicated just recognize that we are that hollow bone that shamanism talks about, where we become the conduit for the information to come through that then uses our body, our voice, our words, our breath to be able to help that person to hear, feel, or see what it is that's necessary for them to move on their path of healing.
Yeah.
We're just holding space for that.
Exactly. Yeah. I love that you said that. And it was funny a moment ago. I said in the role of the healer, right? Very intentionally, because I fully agree with that. It can almost be a red flag. Like maybe, I don't know, maybe there's some confusion around that, and maybe it doesn't have to be all bad, but it gets misused. Just like plant medicine, anything external to us and internal too, from things that are perpetuated in our society, like not honoring the wisdom in our body and not honoring that capacity to self-organize. And like, there's everything is out there. And there's so many miraculous things available through nature, But all of the mechanisms, all of the ways in which we can heal are within us alone. Sometimes, you might need a boost or that metaphorical light shown on you, that space held for you. But yeah, it's all in there. Andrew Taylor Still he's the founder of osteopathy, and the tradition of bodywork I practice is very much in that lineage. I always like to name him, and he would say almost exactly what I just said all the time. And he was both a devout Christian, but also was raised in the indigenous Shawnee community too.
Okay.
And later in his life, and this was very antithetical to, he was in the 1800s. It was like a controversial, good Christian thing to say, that when asked, what is your religious perspective? What do you worship? And he would just start speaking in the Shawnee language and basically say, this is what I identify, with the Great Spirit. And people were like, whoa, not what I was expecting. But yeah, he would still name in sort of English Anglo terms, like God has given us all the gifts of the plants and the medicine, and you can find it all there. But every mechanism for healing is still contained within the human body. If we can find that health and celebrate that health, then people will heal, which is beautiful.
Colin, have you noticed a direct correlation between the more that you hold space for people and the more that you are witness to their healing has moved you further along your own healing path?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Even just in terms of the boundaries between our energies, right? Ultimately, I see that we're all one thing. It's like one blanket. We're all part of this one thing. The sort of this cosmic creative force. We can get into this later, but a little preview. But the reason what they set atomic clocks to is this intrinsic rhythm of the universe. You can have a petri dish of protoplasm or slime mold, and they'll move one direction for 50 seconds and the other direction for 50 seconds. It's a 100-second cycle. It doesn't change. Nothing changed. We are all in this flow. And I think a lot of folks are familiar with it anyways, outside of naming it in that way. I've been practicing Qigong for about 25 years. And when I learned within the realm of osteopathy and craniosacral therapy, which I practice, it's called the long tide. When I learned about that, I was like, oh, that's the name for that thing that I've, been playing with for these decades. And we have, experiences of it, like Satori moments of realization around that stuff. It's amazing how little needs to happen in a session for somebody to experience profound changes, even structural ones. Just listening, literally listening verbally in conversation, but also through my hands, through palpation, having sort of a conversation with someone's physiology. When I'm able to distance myself appropriately, have that right energetic distance, it's incredible to see what happens. And that has taught me so much about my own boundaries and my own, edges, and where we kind of stop and begin, but also are one thing. And it's been it's brought me to tears so many times, truly. Yeah. Just in terms of that, as one part of so many ways to answer that question, which is such a good question. Yeah.
So I definitely want to take a further dive into what you were saying about, how we are all connected and using the reference as a blanket, because that makes me think of what Alan Watts talks about of the cosmic rug. And his mother was a seamstress, so he was very immersed from an early age into fabrics. And how he would talk about, you look at the front of a rug and it's beautiful. It's perfectly in order. It is just exactly as whoever stitched it together meant it to be. But when you flip it over, you see nothing but chaos and all of the threads going every single which way and crisscrossing over one another. And yet you zoom in with a microscope, and all of a sudden you will find order again within the fibers and how they are all fitting together. You zoom in just a little step further, and now you find chaos again, because inside those woven fibers are again fibers that are going all over every which way. And I loved that reference, because to me, it really signifies how in the grand scheme, we are perfectly in order. We are exactly where we need to be in exactly the right time. We're talking to all of the right people. We are interacting in all of the right ways. But as soon as we zoom that perspective in to a little bit more narrow, a little bit more linear way of looking at things, there is chaos, because we see the disconnection that there is in society. We see the disconnection that there are in relationships and friendships and, working professional relationships and things like that. How have you found that view to maintain that big picture perspective, to maintain that picture of oneness, to go back to something that you said about having that energetic distance in a session, to recognize that you can't come to a session with all of your stuff and expect to be able to be present with somebody and hold their stuff?
I love the textile analogy. It's just so good. It's so perfect. All the fabrics and fibers and going in and out and all those layers. And it takes so much humility to maintain that view of that oneness. And from within the healing arts, within craniosacral therapy specifically, or osteopathy or whatever, anything, it really doesn't matter. The concept of that long tide, this unifying sort of cosmic creative force of oneness, which is inescapable. You don't intervene with that. There's nothing to do with that. There can be inert fulcra, like, oh, there's something going on with your collarbone or something, right? You can do some kind of intervention there, right? Within, just to unpack a little bit more, like the long tide, right? I mentioned that. So that's that big creative unifying force. There's a mid tide, which is sort of the energetic field of the local body. And then there's the short tide, or what we call the cranial rhythmic impulse, which is just sort of very local, like the flow of cerebral spinal fluid through the dural canal, the brain, and the spinal cord, or it can be, even just restrictions in muscles, right? We know that happens. So there's some context for that. But in terms of the long tide, that unifying force, that you just bear witness to it. And the more I work in that context, the more I become aware of it and just witness it, the more it really humbles me and amazes me. And all you can do is you can bring your attention to it, bring your awareness to it. And sometimes it can be elusive, where it's like, whoa, there's part of it. Oh, where'd it go? I don't know. And just to bear witness to it, just to bring your acknowledgement to it and honor that as a practitioner. And then in terms of feeling through that with whoever you're working with, it really sustains the capacity to see things as whole and as connected. It's such a gift, and it's just there. It's really incredible.
It's beautiful to hear you reference bodywork sessions very similarly to how I reference breathwork sessions. And my mentor, Stephen Jaggers, who was on the podcast a couple of episodes ago, was talking about it, how he originally started as a bodyworker. And so for him, he's much more comfortable doing in-person sessions and being there working with somebody. But I'll never forget something that he said in my early on training, was that it doesn't matter what modality you are choosing to work with. First and foremost, you're a breath worker. Because until people become engaged with their breath, they can't work on healing themselves. Until they start to really work with the breath in a way where it starts to bring homeostasis within the nervous system and start to regulate the nervous system and breathe deeply into the belly instead of shallow into the upper lungs, or only breathing through the mouth instead of breathing deeply through the nose. Have you noticed that as well within your sessions, that the more people start to engage with the physicality of their body, first and foremost the breath, that really helps to accentuate their own ability to heal at a faster capacity?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the breath too, just to link it back to the whole carpet, the whole blanket thing. It's not just our respiration. It's not just lungs, diaphragm, and all those associated parts. There's breath in every single cell. In the lineage of work that I follow, it's called the breath of life. That was Andrew Taylor Still again in osteopathy. But so that's called primary respiration, which is just that flow, our interconnectedness with that long tide and the wholeness. And it's amazing to me to work specifically with the breath and the diaphragm and the lungs. And I do visceral work and specific work with all of those parts. But it's like we are animated with all of that force. And just to illuminate those parts that might be dormant or stagnant, or maybe there should be this fluctuation and there's this one, and to reorient it to that wholeness, to that long tide, or even working within the mid tide as well. It brings so much balance and so much healing. And in some ways, like if I stepped into like that upper right quadrant, like just science, gross reductionism part of myself, which I'm trained in, but much more than that, of course, like we all are. It's like, I didn't even do anything, what happened? And it's just tuning into that breath, the primary respiration, just that flow, that animation of life that fills all of us and makes us alive as we are. Secondary respiration in this tradition is the breath and the heartbeat. So cardiac and the diaphragmatic breathing and everything. And there are amazing stories of practitioners who have found Andrew Taylor Still, again, he's coming up a lot now, which is good. All due respect. I owe a great deal of debt and gratitude to that man. One story, he found somebody who had drowned and fallen in a frozen river. He was in Wisconsin, I believe, at the time. And the person was dead, right? No secondary respiration, no breath, no heartbeat, nothing. And he laid his hands on this person, and he felt the breath of life, the primary respiration, right? And he was like, oh, no, they're not dead. And he just listened and listened. And then the secondary respiration returned. And he started breathing again. And his heart started beating again. And he just walked away. The person was fine. Which is
what a story.
Like, it's so, I love those stories. But it just speaks to the work, tuning into the breath, both the the acute, the actual flow of air and on all those associated structures, but then how that it goes to every cell and it goes to every thing, and it ultimately goes into that whole blanket. And it unifies us with the animation and just the gloriousness of being alive.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me wonder if there was no one present for that person, would his secondary breath have actually come back? Or
Right.
did the secondary breath come back because there was an empathetic witness there to still see the life that still existed within him?
Right. I choose to believe that the second. Yeah, for sure. Who knows? Maybe, could have been incidental, but that wasn't the only time that happened with him. And it's incredible in my own work and in my own experience too. I've never had a dead person on my table, luckily. But people with serious things, chronic ailments, serious structural imbalances, or, just debilitating anxiety or depression or whatever it may be. And just to have that, be that empathetic witness, like you said, sometimes it's just like, whoosh, it's all gone. There they are again in their health, right? Anybody can find disease. My work and in the tradition I follow is you find health, you celebrate it. And it's amazing how contagious that can be in the process of healing and feeling more balanced.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, especially here in the Pacific Northwest, I feel like anxiety and depression are almost just like a commonplace practice anymore, with just the hustle and bustle of life here of, 5 months of the year it being gray and rainy. And if you're not really into that weather, it can really start to play a significant toll. Do you see a correlation between people who are experiencing emotional effects such as depression and anxiety, with also where they may have stagnation in the body, or, you know, joints that are out of alignment, muscles that are being pulled in just kind of the wrong direction, where it's kind of physical symptoms are showing themselves to show where in the body that emotion may be actually residing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I do. Yeah. And I mean, it's good to have a toolkit of tools, of interventions. Like, I can do this physical thing. I know how to manipulate this thing. I know how this structure works. I really benefit from having my background. It's too easy to poo-poo the science and all that, but I'm also so grateful because I don't have to guess when there is some kind of acute intervention that is available, right, with consent, especially energetically with the individual. But yeah, it's incredible where sometimes, you know, the symptoms that have manifested, you know, that might be pathologized as, you know, depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, the fulcrum, like the imbalance or the tension might actually be like not even in their body, like in the field. And from a scientific perspective, like, that's actually empirically measurable, and we've been measuring that for a long time. Originally they could detect, you know, the heartbeat from 6 feet away. Now it's over 12 feet away, like an
Wow.
EKG with sensitive enough equipment, right? You can read that. And so we, of course, I think as humans are infinitely more sensitive, exquisitely sensitive to those things than any of our best instruments. And we have some really cool instruments, and I like to celebrate those too, but they don't even come close to our capacity to sense and to bear witness to that stuff. So yeah, absolutely. And it's incredible how sometimes just, you know, maybe orienting to long tide, or sometimes you can physically manipulate those things, sort of an acute style intervention. Um, and gross pathologies, things you wouldn't expect, you know, massage, which is not really what I do, but that's what I'm licensed in, among other things, could affect. And it does. It does when you really are, you know, that witness and you hold the space. Yeah, it's cool.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
Now, having received, you know, massages and stuff myself before, I can always remember certain times where someone would hit a certain muscle or a certain pressure point or tension point that I wasn't even aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment I became aware of that, it's almost like it started bringing up all of these different emotions that I hadn't really looked at, I hadn't been aware of. And it's remembering that is really where that question comes from, of like, how much of what we deal with physically actually has nothing to do with our physical body, but has everything to do with our energetic or spiritual body. And really, that's where the work truly lies. But for most of us, we've become so disconnected from those bodies that it's really just this hyper focus of my physical body. I'm just my physical body. I'm just my physical body. When really, our physical body is only just a part of who we are. It's the vessel that we get to experience this world, but not innately who we are.
Right. Yeah, totally. It's the manifestation of all of that unfolding, right? The foundation, the fabric of the whole blanket is that energy, those forces, those wave and particulate forms of stuff that's just swirling around, that we're all a part of and can unify with. And it's amazing how that in itself really is a pathology when we get stuck in the body. And that Cartesian split, thanks to Descartes, which had some cool ideas, but like mind and body are separate, because you know we are our forebears, and people still are just trying to find answers, right? And sometimes we get closer and closer and closer, and there's more reductionism and more reductionism, and then we end up with all these parts, which can be good, but if you can't put them back together and figure out what to do, it's almost pointless. And so yeah, it almost is a disease in itself to get stuck in that and to be resistant to where where this gross body even comes from in the first place. I just the other day, I read a quote from a very surprising source. He's now the King of England. At the time, he was His Royal Majesty Charles. And he said almost exactly what I said. I'll try to get the quote more or less right in what he said, but it was like, modern medicine, as it zooms in more and more and pieces things out into more and more parts and reduces things, is losing sight of the whole being, and therefore is no longer able to orient with what healing even is in the first place, which I love. And I also love that it came from an unexpected source, you know? Yeah.
Somebody that you wouldn't really expect to be diving into like deep thought processes like that, but it's beautifully said, and really I think on the point with where this conversation is continuing to go is just remembering that like there's always more to the picture than what meets the eye if we're only looking at it from just a singular perspective.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm thinking about language, right? And sometimes naming something can be the first step in a healing process. Sometimes the last step, amazingly. You might get a diagnosis that then you're like, oh, that explains everything. Now I'm better. But it also works in the flip, right? And I think I witness this more, where people they're clinging to their diagnoses and they're like, well, I have this, so I can't go beyond it. And it's like, well, actually you can. And even if we were stuck in just that gross reductionist realm of science, if you pay attention, it's like they're changing it all the time. One interesting like physiological fact is, so right in here we have these lymph vessels that return all of our lymph fluid to our heart, right? So blood spills out of blood vessels to bathe cells in the things they need and take up the waste products. And it doesn't all return to the blood vessels. And if it doesn't, it becomes lymph, and the lymphatic system has to return it. All the lymph in your body eventually has to come up here. And originally what they said about that is, for all human beings, 80% returns on the left side, and then the rest comes in on the right, or even less. The equivalent of like a 12-ounce can of some beverage. And just recently they realized, oh, actually, maybe 20% of people, it's the opposite. The majority comes in on the right. And just recently now it's like, oh, maybe half of the people are switched. And, it's just going to keep going like that, which is to say, like, yeah, our systems it's nice. It's good. It's good to be on that journey and to be investigating. But I think never forget that there's more. And that's just one way of looking at stuff. It can be useful and helpful, and thank goodness for it in those acute circumstances where it's like, you're gonna die without this technology we've developed. But still, it can be detrimental, right, to get stuck in those things. I see that so much.
Thank you for touching on that topic, because I think it's really, really important to recognize that getting a clear path in what's going on is important. And just as you said, it's important to have the language around that. But we can't get stuck in that language. We can't then put ourselves in this box where it's like, okay, this is just how it's always going to be. And, I'll use my own personal journey. Like when I was 12, I was diagnosed as ADHD and bipolar. And I even did one podcast with another gentleman who is also ADHD. And he's like, you are the most still, calm person that I've ever known that has ADHD. And it's because I no longer associate with that label. And the moment I stopped associating with that label, I started looking deeper into, well, what does that label even mean? And not only what does it mean, but what does it mean to me? And what does it not mean? And the more I started diving into that, and especially doing the internal work and really getting to know myself and who I am and how I show up, that now it's like I'm willing to bet that if I went and got tested all over again, I probably would not fall under those markers anymore, because I have let go of feeling like that's who I was, those labels. Instead, recognizing back to the, fabric analogy of I am part of a greater whole. And maybe at that time, certain things were manifesting within my life that were creating those symptoms, that were creating me to show up that way. But as life continued to change and I got more in the flow of things, all of a sudden I was no longer associating or showing up in that same way.
Yeah. I totally resonate with that, and I had the same diagnosis of ADHD.
Really?
And went through totally the same process. Yeah, it's just amazing when you actually expand beyond what you've been reduced to. Yeah, that gross reductionism will get you. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing to allow yourself to just be with what's around and be with source, right? And to connect with what's actually possible, which is healing and self-organization. The concept of inherent health that we all are just filled with, exploding with health, and sometimes it gets masked or confused by labels like ADHD diagnosis or something like that. Yeah, it's fascinating. And also, interestingly, stepping into the science realm for a second, there's been a lot of research and push in some research communities and psych communities and neuroscience communities around ADHD actually being a sleep disorder, which is fascinating. As you know, sleep correlates with so much. Like you can just be, not sleeping well, and then it leads to this thing. Or also from another perspective, traumatic events that weren't processed, right? Which where trauma, experiencing trauma or the traumatization of oneself is just a normal physiological process that didn't have the chance to finish, right? To go through its full course. I worked with and I had a mentor, a neuroscience scientist who had a friend who worked on prey animals in the Sahara in Africa. And he would, I don't really know exactly how he did it. It kind of makes me chuckle. But anyways, he would see an animal escape a predator and he would chase him down and take blood samples and measure, things. And you get an idea, right? It's not the whole picture, so take it with a grain of salt, but to check their stress levels essentially and see what's going on. And then they would go off and do their trauma processing. They would essentially convulse or, just like go crazy and make all these noises. And then all of a sudden they appeared fine and he would take another sample and they were fine. And they did not have a trauma response the next time the predator came. They did the normal sort of survival instinct thing, but they weren't like, oh God, oh. I mean, as much as we can anthropomorphize on animals, but I think this is true for humans too. I think it was Peter Levine who said that trauma is a normal physiological response that didn't finish the arc of processing, which lends itself to what we were talking about our diagnoses or any language or framework for dysfunction or disease that keeps you sort of boxed in and prevents healing. It's like, well, actually, there's a process that can continue past that boundary, past that border to that next place where you actually feel home again, where balance can be achieved, which is, I think, just the unadulterated truth of how things really are.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting that you bring that up because in part of the somatic breathwork training, there's a video in one of the early on modules that's of an antelope that escaped from, I can't remember if it was a lion or a cheetah, one of the big cats that's in Africa. And you can see it's doing exactly as you said. It is like almost like it's having a seizure. It's shaking so much. And then it's making these like deep belly breaths coupled with like coughs. And so it's using sound and movement to shift the energy or the stress out of its body so then it can go back to being in a parasympathetic state. It can go back to its normal rest, digest. I'm just an antelope. grazing on the plains, no other thing is going to come after me, and then can immediately flip back into that sympathetic state when it needs to run for its life.
Mm-hmm.
But then it knows the exact process it needs to go through to flip that switch again.
Right.
Whereas I feel like us humans, we forgot the fact that we are innately animals as well,
Mm-hmm.
that we need to have those processes. And when we're kids, we remember that. Temper tantrums, they're that exact thing is a child knows I need to throw a big fit right now because there's a lot of energy in my body that wants to move through me.
Yeah.
But at some point in time, we have somebody tell us, no, that's not okay.
Right.
Please stop doing that.
Yeah.
No, don't cry.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes us start to slowly bottle up those emotions that then we start to carry throughout our lives and wonder, why do so many people deal with chronic disease, with mental health issues? Because we've forgotten that we gotta let go of this stuff.
Right. Yeah. Those responses become the restriction. It's amazing how just the response of a caregiver or anybody, even if they're not influential to you, who just says, especially as a child, like, oh, not that response. And just a regular event, one that might not even be that relatively stressful, becomes a trauma, like a capital T trauma that, manifests in imbalances and disease or pathology for the rest of your life, just from one event. And we have the opportunity through those exercises, through breath work or just an empathetic witness or whatever it may be, to actually work through that, which is something, like you said, we forget. It reminded me I don't even know if I finished this thought earlier, but about the Cartesian split between mind and body, like that those are separate. It's so silly to me. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but it turns out your mind's it's not separate from your body.
Yeah.
And that separation, it leads to such a compartmentalization, and it lends itself to providing such a capacity to objectify ourselves, to objectify things. Like, look at how we treat the world, or indigenous ideas or ancestral ways of healing, or simply what we've been talking about this whole time. It can almost be rooted in that split being a real thing, and it's not, which also goes back to the blanket analogy. It's like you can zoom in on the parts. It's like, yeah, there are parts, but ultimately, are they separate from the whole thing? No, they're not, and they can't be, and they never will be, which can be scary if you've been stuck in that and you don't want to make the transition, because you can get comfortable, even in being uncomfortable, right?
Yeah. Being
dissociated and just dysregulated, which I spent so much of my life in both of those states. And yeah, a huge part of my journey was just understanding that was even possible. So which is to celebrate, like, okay, naming that was good, but then to continue through with the journey, which was the scary part. To know thyself is terrifying. It can be, and then to go where you need to go is hard, but it's so worth it.
Yeah, to know thyself is really the ultimate journey of life. Which, of course, like you noted, one of the scariest journeys you could possibly take, because the truth is, the more you dive into yourself, the more you realize you don't actually know yourself.
Right. Yeah, and like, who am I? How am I not myself? I don't know why that quote came in my head from My Heart Alchemy. I love that. Yeah, for anybody who's aware of that's a good show. Yeah, it's almost comical how that quote, which is so profound and simple, can just seem like almost stupid, and it's so the antithesis of that. Just to sit with it. Yeah.
So, Colin, what are the practices that you use for yourself to keep you regulated, to keep you being able to continue to show up for your clients in the way that you do?
Yeah, connecting with nature, right? Just grounding, being on the earth. It's amazing, which goes into, I mean, I love how interwoven this conversation is with everything, but going into that bigger connection. But literally, what that literally looks like for me is just barefoot on on the earth, on dirt or grass, especially when it's wet. To bring in some science, you know, there's negative ions there, and we run on a net positive charge, and the interactions between those things, between us and the earth, are instantaneous. And like, it's I love how that folds in with language too, like grounding, the ground, it's grounding. I don't know, maybe that sounds stupid, but it's so profound to me. I find that even if I just, you know, I'm really tired, maybe I stayed up, maybe I was doing too much screen late at night, I'll go stand in the grass and I sleep so much better. I was reading, there were some researchers who really wanted to assay that, like to look at that process and see what's going on there and how quickly does it happen. And their instruments, as sensitive and exquisite as they were, could not keep up with how quickly that happened. They could detect the change, but it was like instantaneous. Feet on the ground, a full systemic change for the individual. And they're like, well, it's happening, but it's happening so fast we can't tell you about those processes, which honestly, I don't really care. It's like, yeah, you don't need, you know, sometimes research is so silly. They're like, oh, it turns out that oxygen is good for, it's like, did you need to do that, you know? Which gets into like the ancestral wisdom that we just have disregarded in many ways, you know, as a culture. And I think it's clear that there are people, you and I, for example, who are embracing those things, and it's so rich and rewarding, and it can be a slap in the face sometimes, like, oh yeah, we've been doing this forever.
Do you foresee that that's kind of the direction in which that modern day medicine is most likely going to inevitably go, of this merging of ancestral healing wisdoms with modern day science to really finally make the determination that they've both kind of been saying similar things for a really long time?
Yeah.
Science just didn't want to admit it.
Right. I do believe, and I try not to be deluded around it, but that it's going to come full circle. I feel like it has to, unless there's some permanent dystopian takeover and things just don't progress. But if science truly progresses on its arc, like if the scientific method, which is different than scientism, which we see a lot of that these days, like, just, you don't resonate with my idea, you know, like, that's not science. Science is just observe. What are all the rules of science? Observe. If we observe long enough, yeah, I truly believe it will come full circle. And I don't know if you're familiar with integral theory, Ken Wilber, and all that stuff. So I think a lot of folks will be familiar with sort of like the developmental hierarchies, like Maslow's hierarchy, or any indigenous thing. There's usually about 8-ish stages of development, where you have an archaic stage, which is just like reptilian, I don't know, it's archaic, right? And then you get mythic, and then you get magical, and then you get pre-rational, and then rational, and then pluralistic, which is postmodern thinking, right? Fragment everything, gross reductionism, put it into all these parts. But the major fallacy with postmodern thinking, or the pluralistic stage of consciousness, is that then you don't do anything with it. You just have all these pieces lying around, and you might get stuck with one, like, this is my piece right here. And it's like, well, actually those pieces were, you know, you just shredded the carpet and you have one of the fibers in your hand and you're like, this is it. Like, this is how I identify, which is, you know, that's part of the thing, but it's not the whole thing. And it's inaccurate and it's not true. And then after pluralistic, in that arc, which I think is just, it's just a natural process. It's how like an individual human develops. It's how societies have developed. And I think it's how this whole arc of medicine and science and indigenous wisdom are all going to come back together as you get to this integral phase, where it actually does come back together, where every stage below you've transcended, but you're also now including, right? And I find a lot of optimism and hope in that perspective. Maybe it's not true, but I believe it.
I'd say for me that resonates as well. And I feel like that is we're kind of the dawn of that age of moving into integrating all of the knowledge that's at our disposal. I mean, we've basically spent the last close to 25 years with internet, with having so much more information at all of our fingertips than we've ever had before. So because we have so much more information, that gives us a much larger picture to begin to start to take a look at, whereas before internet, you had the radio, you had TV, you just had limited sources on where that information was coming from. And many people just took it for face value and never questioned, is that actually real information, or is that just somebody's opinion that
Right.
then is just getting pushed as true information?
Yeah.
Now we have the ability to really start to look at all of that stuff, compare that information and where it's coming from, compare information from, hundreds, if not thousands of years ago of information that's starting to come out to know, oh, maybe there isn't much truth to that anymore. Maybe the truth really lies over here with what the indigenous cultures have been saying for all along. We just didn't want to listen to it because we would rather be comfy in our fancy cars and homes.
Yeah, exactly.
Than coming back to nature.
Yeah. And just using our cognition and forgetting intuition or not trusting it. Like I think even in our most stuck, even in my most stuck state, I was still like, well, I mean, intuition's obviously still a thing, but it kind of gets tossed aside. Like it doesn't have the value, or it won't provide for truth. Like there's no truth because you can't put it in the traditional models of empirical assessment or something like that, which is, it's so sad. What you just said reminded me of, I don't know if it's my favorite story. It's hard for me to have favorite anythings, a glimpse in my personality, but it's up there. So there was an indigenous elder and some Western sort of colonial folk were there. I think it was a scientist, or maybe a scientist missionary person, I think good intentions this person had. And he was, sort of befriended by this group of people and said, hey, elder, would you like to come with me to the ocean? I got to make a trip. And he'd never even traveled, very far in his life, let alone to the ocean. I think he was from the Great Plains in the United States now, as we call it. He took him to the ocean, and he just stood there on the shore. He just stood there, and he just witnessed the ocean before him. That's it. For a long time. And then he didn't say anything. The Westerner, or, whatever, the colonist was like, oh, well, what'd you experience? What'd you do? And he just didn't say anything. And they go back. He goes back to his people, and they're sitting there in council. And he proceeds to describe ocean life in so much detail, probably more detail than they even had at the time within the paradigm that this colonist came from, about currents, about that there was like tropical regions and polar regions, and there were mammals so big you couldn't imagine, and like microbes and plankton, and like incredible detail. He didn't have those names for it, but described it so articulately that it was clear that that's what he had witnessed just from standing there. I just love that.
To be so present that you can tap into everything that is existing in that moment, even beyond what you can actually see and recognize at the time.
Right. Yeah. Which to get into that hierarchy again of sort of consciousness development, which is a categorical hierarchy, not a dominator hierarchy. Those are bad, right? But categorically, after integral, you get to this supra, S-U-P-R-A sort of consciousness, which is clearly where that individual was, where you are every breath that ever existed all at one time. And so, yeah, of course you could have awareness, of what's going on within the depths of things that you can't see, right? With your gross structures in an acute sense, but it's there and you can bear witness to it because it's on the other side of the blanket, right? That you are a part of. Yeah.
Yeah. Being able to tap into that first breath, that energy that exists all around, and to be so tapped in. I mean, I love using this analogy because it's, modern day pop culture, but it's just like Star Wars. It's like the Force, it's the thing that the Jedis believed in, of when you can tap into the midichlorians that are in your body that are connected to all of the energy that exists in the foreseeable universe, that you can feel, see, hear things that are happening that are outside of your immediate awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel like those are science fiction. I feel like that is, like I said, modern day pop culture showing us what's actually possible. Right. But the one thing that I find interesting that's along the lines of all of those types of stories about people harnessing their own innate powers and getting in touch with, the magic of the universe, is they meditate, they train their bodies, they clear out their minds, they get rid of the fear, they bring themselves into such a state of harmony that they can become that present to what is always there, always accessible, but it's only accessible from that state of presence.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that really is going back to the question, what do I do? How do I take care of myself? How am I able to show up? It's that, or at least attempting that. It's a practice, right? That's why they call it a practice. But yeah, practicing just presence. So through meditation, through Qigong, through breath work, through the grounding I mentioned. And I mean, just having awareness of myself, just doing exercises, sort of somatic exercises of just like awareness, just feeling through everything. Sometimes in osteopathic circles, we call it resourcing, right? Resourcing might be listen to a song you like, play some music, sit on the beach, whatever. But also you can just sit and bring your awareness to like, what resources do you have? Which is an amazing way to resource. Gratitude, right? Having gratitude. That's another way to articulate that.
Yeah, I always like to get people to engage in gratitude at the end of breathwork practices, and to remind them that to hold gratitude is to hold the highest vibration that you can.
Mm-hmm.
Because gratitude is just infinite, unconditional love for everything that exists.
Yeah.
And how can you not lean more into that?
Yeah. The best medicine. Yeah.
So, Colin, what is one thing in your life that you had to embrace in order to expand into the person you are today?
Such a good question. I had so many thoughts, so many things came up for me when I think about that question. And I really wanted to just see what came up in this moment, right? What's going to be most authentic for me, and feel, true to how we've engaged and what energy we're in here. And for me, it's nature, all caps though. We talked about language, right? And how that can be a barrier and a limitation, but it's also such a great way to like point at something. And it's nature in all caps. I like to describe it that way, because to me, that's another way of saying like awareness of the wholeness, the blanket. It's kept me grounded. It oriented me into, leaving my career and getting into this work, into really working on myself, awareness of sort of the cosmic creative force that's responsible for all things, that is creation. That's me, that's you, that's everything. Embracing that as a truth, it just has been completely transformative. And I feel like when I'm able to hold that truth within myself and have, the right distance and the right boundaries, and be present enough with people to orient them to that, it's amazing what happens. And, sometimes I do a little this, I do a little that, whatever. But I think the work and orienting people towards health actually comes from that more than it does from those physical interventions, if they even happen. I do like to move people's cranial bones around. That's pretty fun. But yeah.
It's a fantastic answer. Nature in all caps. And so just for like clarification, nature as in all caps as really like recognizing the divine nature that we all are, and
Mm-hmm.
not just nature as the physical manifestation that we can see.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And it's true. Thanks for the clarification, because it's like nature. What is nature? There's so many ways to define it. And, like within that Cartesian split, like humans aren't nature. Nature is going outside, not that, right? We are nature, right? Nature as just existence. That makes my answer seem too simple, but it's like the quote, know thyself, right? Sometimes the simplest things are the most profound. And yeah, nature as in, we're all part of the blanket, man.
Yeah. We're each a fiber.
Yeah. Yeah.
That just makes that beautiful carpet of existence.
Right. That connects to the next fiber. Yeah. Yeah. Thinking about when you were talking about zooming in too, and you get layers and layers, like here's organization, here's chaos, here's organization, here's chaos. And some of the most fundamental like rules, I sometimes like to bring myself back to the scientific realm and to orient that. This is me going inside and flipping the system, right, in real time. So entropy is the second law of thermodynamics, that all systems in isolation increase in chaos. Well, in fact, the human body is a direct contradiction of that rule. Organization from disorganization, right? Our very existence makes that law not so substantial anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that is wonderful to recognize and to remember.
Absolutely. So, Colin, what's one last piece of advice that you could leave the listeners with who really enjoyed what you had to say and want to lean more into how can they connect more with their bodies and really become in tune with their own nature?
Mm-hmm. I think it's that everything we need to self-organize, to heal, is already within us, and to embrace that one is true, and that it's possible to go through that journey. Sometimes it's nice to have support, but to also remember that the support is there too, in terms of that long tide we were talking about, or the cosmic creative force, or Gaia, or prana, however, whatever word is most convenient to describe. We can lean into that and have connection that we might not have thought was there. In other words, you're not alone, and you can do it.
Wonderful advice. Wonderful advice. Well, Colin, I really appreciate your time today and coming onto the show and talking with us, sharing your backstory, and really just for the amazing work that you were doing here in the Seattle area of just trying to get people to come back to their bodies.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure being on the show, and thank you for the work you're doing. I have so much respect for it, and I would anyways, but I think, like you said in the beginning, you're my cousin, you're in my family. I think that's such a beautiful thing. And the trauma I experienced, and the trauma that exists in our lineage, in our families, and in our global family as humans. It's just a beautiful thing, and it's worth all the respect. Yeah. So thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, not to make this take a little bit longer, but I love that you brought that up, because it's beautiful to be able to see two individuals that do share a common lineage, both doing that work, recognizing that as we do the work within ourselves, we're healing all of the generation that came before us and all of the generation that comes after us. And, you being a father, you visibly get to see at how that shift is happening in real time with your family, coming from the fact that you've been doing this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sometimes they say breaking the cycle, but it's
wonderful.
beautiful. Yeah. So grateful.
Well, thanks again for being here, Colin. And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Embrace and Expand podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with Colin, I have all of his information in the show notes below, so you can get in contact with his website. If you're local to the Seattle area, I highly recommend going and getting some body work from Colin. All of his information is on the website, clear and precise, so you can schedule a time to go see him. So thanks again for being here. Thanks again for listening to another episode, and I'll catch you on the next one.